Hey everybody, what is up? Welcome back to Final Trade. So for the last several years, we've been hearing on and off warnings about how many cards Pokemon USA is printing and that they have dramatically increased the amount of cards they print every year in these last several years since 2021. And we see those numbers every year when Pokemon USA finishes its fiscal year. They've released those numbers, and they have for a long time, going back into the past. So what I've done today is I've actually pulled down those data, I've compiled those numbers, and I want to talk about them. Now, I have been on record before saying that basically it doesn't matter. Yes, they printed billions and billions of cards, and at one time the number of cards they had printed in a single year was something like 20% of all the cards they had ever printed, going back to the early 2000s. And it did not matter. And we're going to actually look at those data and talk about them. So the Pokemon USA fiscal year goes from April to March. And so that's why you have these weird spans for each year from April to March. And I've put in this column the number of cards they printed in billions. And then I did a cumulative column and a percent of total. And the percent of total is of the most recently known total. It is not the percent of total up to that year in time. And so what we see is that this was the big year right here. It was April of 21 to March of 22. All of a sudden, they printed 9.1 billion cards. And if they had only printed up to 57 billion by the end of that year, well, yes, 9.1 billion. That's going to be, what, 1/6 of all they had ever printed, so about 16%. And then the subsequent year, they ran that up a little more to 9.7 billion. And again, the next year to 11.9. And from April of 24 to March of 25, they pulled it back to 10.2 billion cards. And so we've heard some people online say that, well, this means that none of this is actually scarce, none of it is rare, none of it is valuable, none of it can go up in value. You'll hear various claims about it from different people. And the only claim I make is, what are the prices today? What are the number of dollars that people have parted with recently without coercion in order to obtain these products? And that's what TCG Player gives us. And so what I've done to the right here is I've said for this time period, for instance, April of 2020 to March of 21, what were the regular sets that came out? Not the special sets, but just the regular ones. So for that time period, we got Rebel Clash, Darkness Ablaze, Vivid Voltage, and Battle Styles. And today, in the market, the average price for a booster box of those four sets is $250. And the next year, we got what was probably the most amazing year in Pokemon history. Chilling Reign, Evolving Skies, Fusion Strike, and Brilliant Stars. Unbelievable. The average box today between those four sets being $860, of course, because Evolving Skies is $1,900 plus, and Fusion Strike is almost $800. Brilliant and Chilling are merely $400 a box. And on, I have these listed for the rest. And the way we need to think about this is these products, they generally have a print life of about 2 years. And Pokemon USA is a little more squishy with that because the Pokemon market is centered mainly around collecting and not playing. So for instance, when a standard Magic expansion cycles out of standard legality, basically it loses a ton of value immediately. But when a regular Pokemon expansion cycles out of that same analogous legality and Pokemon competitive play, it doesn't really lose value because the majority of people buying Pokemon are buying it to collect, not to play with. And so what we can think of is, let's say for these sets, Rebel Clash, Darkness Ablaze, Vivid Voltage, and Battle Styles, the sets that came between April of 2020 and March of 21, well, how many total cards were printed while those were in their supported life? And this will not be an absolutely clean comparison because we don't know the distribution of cards between all of these expansions. And, if we think about these 3.7 billion that were printed right here in the first year of these 4 expansions, well, some of those were back for previous era products. But if we simply count going forward, there were 22.5 billion cards printed during the same period that these 4 expansions were supported. 22.5 billion cards, and today we can see the average market price of these 4 expansions booster boxes on TCG Player is about $250. If we roll forward to the next year and we take the next 3 years' sum number of cards printed, 30.7 billion cards, so about 8 billion additional cards. And yet we have the 4 expansions that have some of the best performance in all of the history of Pokemon on a compound annual growth rate basis. And they were printed in this time period when 30.7 billion cards were printed. And that's why I say it does not matter. We look out there at the market price of these boxes today. We look at how thin the market is. We look at how coveted the singles from these expansions still are. It does not matter that 30.7 billion cards were printed during the supported print life of these 4 products. And if we go onwards, Astral Radiance, Lost Origin, Silver Tempest, and on into Scarlet and Violet Base, an average price of $350 per booster box for those 4 on TCG Player today. And combined, even higher, 31.8 billion cards. And yet, we see these prices doing well. We see that all of these boxes are up several multiples from their original wholesale costs. And so we see that it really did not matter that billions and billions of cards were printed. It did not matter that Pokemon USA jumped from a mere 3.7 billion cards printed this year to 9.1 the next year, an increase of 2.5 times. It didn't matter. And it didn't matter that they kept the pedal to the metal, and on and on and on. Now, it can start to matter in the future, because if suddenly a lot of buyers go away for an extended period of time, Pokemon USA is necessarily going to overshoot on the print run numbers. And let's say that 50% of the buying market, the dollars that would be put into Pokemon TCG, went away over the course of, say, 6 months. So in business terms, a very rapid decline in potential revenue that they could reach out there and grab in exchange for their cards. Well, Pokemon USA would overshoot. They'd probably still be printing at 10 billion plus cards per year, and then those sets would take a long time to tighten up in the market and go up. And Pokemon USA would be rather resistant to cutting the print runs, because they would project forward from those print runs to the revenue they would expect to get off of selling that product in the future. And they would say, man, we don't want to cut our revenue in half. And so they would be very slow to act. And part of that is just corporate inertia. And part of it is that necessarily they are making decisions that have very, very long timelines before they play out and you see the results of what you've decided. So in the future, yes, it could start to matter again. If a significant portion of all the dollars chasing Pokemon cards went away permanently, and that's the thing, they have to go away permanently, because what else did we see in this time period? Well, we saw in late 2021, that was when Celebrations came out, and Pokemon USA held back 5 or 6 expansions worth of reprints in order to allow Celebrations to have its time in the market and amongst collectors and players. And then they crushed the market with all of those reprints in a very short time period. September/October of 2021, they absolutely annihilated the market with those reprints. And so in this time period, we had the Pokemon bear market. And in fact, it went all the way past March of 2024. And so during that bear market, they printed nearly 30 billion additional cards during a bear market. And yet here we are today with the prices what they are. Evolving Skies at $1,900, Lost Origins at $500, Silver Tempest at $360, a whole bunch of Scarlet and Violet, early Scarlet and Violet sets at $200 plus. Here we are, even after they printed so heavily through a bear market. And so that's why I point out that In order for this to change in the future, we have to see a dramatic decrease quickly in the number of dollars that buyers are willing to put towards Pokemon, and it has to be sustained. Because when that dramatic decrease happened after late 21, it was not sustained. It went for a couple of years, and then all the madness came back. So it will have to be sustained, and it will have to be rather quick. Because let's say that Pokemon starts seeing a 5% reduction in revenue every year consistently. Let's say for the next decade, okay? And so they end up at approximately that same 50% reduction. You know, it depends on if you count it compounding or not. But let's say a 5% reduction per year. They'll adjust to that. Year to year to year, they'll make the minor adjustments, and they'll be less resistant to those adjustments when it's necessary to make them. So there is a chance in the future that this changes, but simply pointing at the number of billions of cards printed and just saying, hey, that's a dramatically high number, therefore none of this can go up in price, is not logical. And in fact, the data tell us that that's wrong. So don't hang your hat on that. If you want to make arguments against the long-term Pokemon market, by all means, argue that a lot of the buying capital is going to go away when the market crashes next time and it's never coming back. I would tend to disagree with you. I wouldn't outright say you're wrong, but I would tend to disagree because the last time we saw a large percentage of buying capital go away from Pokemon in late 21 and early 22, well, it came back 2 years later, 2.5 years later. So I would be more inclined to say, yes, it can go away. A significant amount can go away on a quick timeline for a short period, but it will probably come back, or significantly all of it will probably come back in a reasonable amount of time. So I would never say that I thought Pokemon was condemned simply because it goes into the next natural bear market. So don't start thinking too dramatically simply based on these numbers, because as we see, you can print 30 billion cards in the lifetime of these expansions and still have this kind of tremendous performance. So let me know what you think, guys. I think a lot of times, selling doom and gloom in a market is a lot easier than selling optimism and patience. And so the people who always talk about it's never meant to be this way, it can't work like this, it can't go on this way, it's all going to crash, it's not going to have that kind of performance. It's easy to make those kind of videos, ignore all data, never present a single number, and simply try and sell doom and gloom. But if you want to actually look at data, actually see what happened, what were the inputs to the system, how might we model it, and what outputs do we get, that's what we do here at Final Trade. Let me know what you think, guys. Thanks to everyone who makes this content possible, especially my very generous supporters on Patreon. Like, comment, share, and subscribe, and join me on Final Trade.